Texas, October 1944, and the train came in beneath a sky so wide and empty that the men looking out through the slats of the cattle cars could not tell whether the land ahead of them was dead, sleeping, or simply too vast to care that they had arrived. For days the wheels had hammered south and west through a country none of them understood, past towns whose names meant nothing, past grain elevators, water towers, freight depots, and long plains that seemed to unroll forever under a white sun. Before that there had been the ship, and before the ship the cages and collection points in France, and before France the collapse, the running, the shouting, the smoke, the orders that no longer matched reality, the officers who still talked about recovery while entire formations dissolved around them. Most of the men on that train had been captured somewhere in the wreckage of Germany's retreat from the West. Some had come out of Normandy with faces burned dark by sun and exhaustion. Some had been taken after defensive lines snapped farther inland. A few still carried fragments of mud from hedgerows in their boots and shrapnel in their flesh. Nearly all of them had crossed an ocean they had never expected to see from inside a prisoner's convoy. They had not imagined America this way. In the stories fed to them before capture, America had always been a nation of noise, excess, weak morals, strong machines, and smiling treachery. It was a place of soft hands and hard punishments, of people too rich to understand suffering and too triumphant to show mercy. They had been told again and again that if German soldiers ever fell into American hands, captivity would not be straightforward. It would be decorated humiliation. They would be mocked for sport, fed just enough to keep working, displayed for civilians, insulted, stripped of every last remnant of military dignity, and then forgotten behind wire until disease or despair did the rest. Those ideas had grown inside them for years, planted by newspapers, speeches, briefings, barracks talk, and the hard certainty of men who never imagined they would one day depend on the decency of the enemy. So when the train finally stopped and the doors were yanked open and the hot Texas light poured in like a physical force, they did not see a camp. They saw the shape of all the warnings they had been taught to fear. Raus, a German-speaking American voice called from outside, heavily accented and impatient. Out. Move. The first men climbed down stiffly, blinking into dust and sunlight. Boots hit packed earth. Chains rattled. A guard tower stood beyond them, dark against the brightness. Farther back rose long rows of low wooden barracks, square and plain, arranged with practical repetition. There was wire, of course, and posts, and guarded gates, and a flag moving in the wind above a cluster of administrative buildings. There were laundry lines and sheds and water tanks, and a mess hall with a roof of corrugated metal that flashed under the sun. The camp was neither theatrical nor savage. It looked, to the more observant among them, like the sort of place built by men who expected things to be counted, repaired, inspected, and recorded. But fear does not greet order with gratitude when fear has been taught that order itself is a trap. The prisoners were lined up, counted twice, then marched through a receiving area where their names, ranks, units, and visible conditions were recorded by clerks sitting behind folding tables. Some of the Americans were old for soldiers. Some limped. Some wore the look of men whose lungs, knees, or eyes had kept them out of Europe and put them on guard duty in Texas instead. A few were young and sharp-faced, boys made stern by uniforms. One tall sergeant with a weather-cut face and a left sleeve rolled past a scarred forearm watched the line with a stillness that seemed colder than shouting would have. He did not bark unless necessary. When he did, men moved. Behind him stood a medic with a satchel and an orderly carrying thermometers, bandages, and a clipboard. One by one the prisoners were examined. Their hair was checked for lice. Their armpits were checked for rash and infection. Mouths were inspected. Fevers were noted. Men with open sores or limp-heavy gaits were marked and moved aside. A private from Württemberg named Dieter Kramer, whose face had gone waxy on the train and whose teeth had chattered through the last night though the air was warm, was pulled from line and sent toward the infirmary with 3 others. By evening the rumor was already running through the barracks that the weak were being separated first because they were easiest to remove. "You see," muttered Feldwebel Ernst Bremer, an older non-commissioned officer whose collarbones stood like hooks beneath skin and whose authority had outlived the battlefield. Always the sick first. No witnesses. No trouble. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and, according to himself, against fools in every uniform ever issued. He carried captivity like a personal insult and treated uncertainty as disloyalty. Younger men listened because they were afraid not to. Others listened because his certainty felt more familiar than silence. Karl Brenner, a 31-year-old railway clerk from Cologne turned infantry reservist turned prisoner, said nothing as he sat on the edge of a newly assigned bunk and watched dust float through the slanting light. He had learned during the last months in France that the loudest men were often the least accurate, but he had also learned that being correct did not make one safe. Across from him, 19-year-old Otto Weiss from a village near Regensburg turned a wool blanket over in his hands as if it might hide a message. It smelled of lye soap, storage, and many washings. Why give us new blankets if they mean to kill us? Otto whispered once Bremer had moved away to speak with 2 former artillerymen. Karl looked toward the open barracks door where guards passed in silhouettes. Because they need us alive for something, he said. It was meant to reassure. It did not. Before sunset, every man had been deloused, issued camp clothing where necessary, assigned a bunk, and marched to chow. There the food was served with almost offensive exactness. Beans were ladled by measure. Bread was counted out. Coffee, thin and black, was poured into tin cups. Men who had known what it meant to go hungry on the retreat suspected insult in the portions immediately. Why count so carefully unless starvation was being planned? Why not dump food freely if food was real? Again Bremer had an answer. This is how you weaken men, he said. You teach them to thank you for precision. But Karl noticed things Bremer did not mention. He noticed that the ladle size was the same for every man in line. He noticed that the medic had stopped one prisoner from gulping too fast and sent him back with a slower order, not a punishment. He noticed salt on the table. He noticed water barrels refilled before they ran dry. The first night in the barracks, few slept deeply. The building creaked in the wind. Men coughed, shifted, muttered, and dreamed in fragments of shellfire, engines, and seawater. Someone cried out for his mother in the darkness and was silent afterward as if ashamed. 2 bunks down, Otto lay awake staring up at the underside of the planks above him, listening to the strange insect hum outside and the unfamiliar emptiness of Texas night. Germany had sounds that belonged to villages, tram lines, bells, church clocks, factory whistles, and the close geography of old roads. Texas had wind and distance. It was possible to believe the whole world had ended outside the wire and only this camp remained. In the morning they were counted again, marched to wash, marched to breakfast, then assembled in the yard while a captain read the camp rules through an interpreter. The prisoners would obey all lawful orders. Escape attempts would be met with force. Contraband would be confiscated. Medical needs would be treated. Work details would be assigned according to regulations. Letters home would be permitted through official channels subject to censorship. Religious services would be arranged. Fighting in barracks would not be tolerated. Theft of rations or equipment would be punished. The captain's voice was dry, even, almost bored, as though mercy and discipline were both merely forms to be filled out correctly. Some of the prisoners found that more unsettling than open contempt. Cruelty made sense inside the world they had been taught. Bureaucratic fairness did not. In the days that followed, the camp began to reveal itself, though not in the language the prisoners trusted. Bedding from the dirtiest transport cars was stripped out and burned after inspection. Men watched smoke rise behind the wash sheds and took it for a sign. They whispered that the Americans were showing them what happened to anything considered contaminated. In truth, the bedding was alive with lice, and the camp medical officer knew exactly what happened when fever and vermin took hold inside crowded barracks. Weak men were taken to the infirmary, treated, and, to the disappointment of rumor, returned alive with cleaner bandages and less fever in their eyes. Dieter Kramer came back after 3 days with quinine, broth in his belly, and a medical chit excusing him from labor for a week. Some of the barracks stared at him as if he were a ghost or an informer. "Well," Bremer demanded, "what did they do?" Dieter, still unsteady, sat on his bunk and looked at the floorboards. "They lowered my fever," he said. Bremer's mouth tightened. "For now." Yet even suspicion needs fuel, and facts, when repeated enough, begin to steal it. A man with an infected hand received proper cleaning and dressings. Another with dysentery was isolated before the whole barracks fell sick. A cough sweeping one hut was met with inspections, soap, and a quarantine schedule that annoyed everyone and saved many. None of this made the camp kind. The guards still carried rifles. Their boots still rang on the boardwalks between barracks. Men were ordered, searched, corrected, and punished when they violated rules. One afternoon a former Panzer crewman struck another prisoner in line over stolen bread, and both were taken out, questioned, and confined separately. The harder of the two emerged furious that the Americans had treated the theft and the assault as two distinct offenses instead of letting the stronger man settle matters. "They interfere in everything," he spat. "Of course they do," Karl said quietly afterward. "That is what keeps camps from becoming animal pens." Bremer heard him and turned. "You speak like them already." Karl met the Feldwebel's gaze only briefly. "No. I speak like a man who has seen what happens when nobody is responsible." The words lingered between them like a dare. Bremer said nothing then, but from that day forward he watched Karl more carefully. Camp life settled into a strict rhythm that made time feel both faster and heavier. Reveille. Count. Washington chow. Work assignments. Return. Count again. Meals, inspections, barracks maintenance, evening silence. The Americans ran the place on whistles, lists, buckets, ledgers, and a faith in procedure so consistent that at first many prisoners mistook it for emotional emptiness. But routine, they discovered, could hold a kind of morality of its own. If the latrine trench needed lime, it was limed. If a pump stuttered, a repair crew came. If the roof of Barracks 4 leaked after a hard rain, lumber appeared within 2 days. If a man was excused from work detail by the medic, the sergeant in charge did not drag him out to make a point. That last one stunned them more than any speech would have. In Germany, by the end, weakness had become its own crime. In Texas, weakness was inconvenient, sometimes resented, but still treated as a fact to be managed rather than a stain to be punished. The first labor detail left the camp under a pale morning sky at the end of October. 24 prisoners were marched to trucks, counted aboard, and driven out beneath guard toward a farm operation several miles away where a late harvest had bogged down for lack of hands. As they rolled past fence lines, mesquite scrub, and fields stretching toward a horizon that seemed to retreat the longer one looked at it, the prisoners braced themselves for the second part of the nightmare. If the camp was the machinery of captivity, surely civilian America would be its fury. That is what they had been promised. That is what they prepared to meet. Instead, they found a place of work. The farm belonged to Eli Parker, a narrow-shouldered widower with sun-blackened hands and a face so cut by weather that every expression looked tired. He stood beside the foreman's shed in a hat bleached pale by years and watched the truck unload with no sign of welcome. Beside him, one of the American guards read out the day's procedures. Tools would be counted before and after labor. Water breaks would be enforced. No prisoner would leave sight of the field lane without escort. Anyone injured would report immediately. Anyone attempting contact with civilians without permission would be removed. Parker said only one thing before the work began. "My boy is in France," he told the guard, "not the prisoners. Then these men stay where I can see them." There was no friendliness in it, and yet there was no bloodlust either. The prisoners spread out under supervision and began picking, loading, hauling, and stacking. The work was real. Their backs learned that first. The sun, though milder than summer, still came down hard by noon. Dust climbed into their nostrils and settled in the seams of their clothing. Gloves rubbed blisters into palms already rough from campaign and captivity. But water came at fixed intervals. The guards did not withhold it for effect. A barrel was rolled out, cups passed, men counted, men returned. When Otto, unused to the pace and still carrying the thinness of the retreat in his body, swayed in the row and dropped to one knee, the closest guard did not strike him or accuse him of malingering. The same tall sergeant from camp, Walker, crossed the field in long steps, crouched, took one look at Otto's face, and called for shade. "He's overheated," he said to Parker and the others. "Sit him up. Slow." He spoke as if the matter were mechanical. A canteen cap was used to wet the boy's neck. The medic on the truck checked his pulse, cursed the Texas sun, and excused him from the next hour. Otto was too embarrassed to meet anyone's eyes when he was allowed back up. That night in the barracks, Bremer dismissed the whole thing. "They need labor," he said. "Of course they do not want him dead in the field." But the explanation, while not impossible, felt thinner than before. Because Walker had not acted like a man preserving equipment. He had acted like a man preventing harm. There is a difference, and frightened people notice it even when they try not to. Over the next weeks more details went out. Some worked cotton. Some repaired fencing along ranch land. Some loaded crates at a county depot where canned goods and grain sacks were shifted from trucks to rail cars. Some cut brush or cleared drainage ditches. Everywhere the same strange pattern followed them. The Americans remained firm. They did not forget that the Germans were prisoners. But their firmness was bound to rules, not mood. If the heat rose too far, schedules changed. If a man opened a blister into bleeding, the medic wrapped it. If civilians gathered too close along a road, the guards moved the prisoners away. On one transport route through a small town, several women standing outside a store stared at the truck as it passed. One lifted a hand to her mouth and said something Carl could not hear. Another, younger and angrier, shouted, "My brother's in Italy because of you." A boy beside her picked up a stone, but before he could throw it, a guard at the back of the truck snapped, "Drop it," with such force that the child froze. The stone fell. The truck kept moving. That night the Germans talked about the women's faces more than the shout itself. There had been hatred there, yes, and grief, and a coldness none of them could claim they did not deserve. But the Americans had still stood in between. Why? The question kept returning without answer. Why protect enemy prisoners from the rage of one's own people? Why insist on water breaks for captured men when sons were dying overseas? Why repair roofs before winter for those who had come wearing the enemy's field gray? The simplest answer, that these Americans believed power came with obligations, was the hardest for the prisoners to accept because it meant their deepest teachings had not only been wrong but inverted. By mid-November, the camp had acquired its own internal politics, because no group of defeated men lives in close confinement without building new hierarchies out of memory, resentment, and fear. Bremer gathered around himself a small ring of harder cases who could not tolerate ambiguity. Some were genuine believers. Some were merely men who feared that admitting error in one thing would force them to reconsider everything. They scorned gratitude, mocked the younger prisoners who accepted medical treatment too readily, and interpreted every decent act by the Americans as camouflage. When letters home began to be permitted in brief, censored forms through the proper channels, Bremer called them bait. "They want to hear us beg," he said. Yet the men wrote. They wrote because mothers might still be alive in cities already hit by bombs. They wrote because wives might think them dead. They wrote because the human need to place a name before a loved one's eyes can overpower pride. Carl wrote to his sister in Cologne with cramped care, avoiding any line that might be struck out by censors. Alive. Captured in France. In Texas. Not badly wounded. Hope you remain safe. He did not know if the letter would ever cross the Atlantic, or if Cologne still stood enough to receive one, but the act of writing steadied him. Across from him, Otto chewed his lip over the address line, embarrassed by his own hand shaking. "Will they even deliver to villages?" he asked. "If there is still a village," Karl said before he could stop himself. Otto looked down. "Yes," Karl added more gently. "Write anyway." When replies began to come back months later, often delayed and sparse, the emotional order of the barracks shifted. A man who had seemed unbreakable sat on his bunk with a postcard in both hands and wept because his wife had written only 3 lines, and all of them were about coal, rationing, and the fact that their son now slept in a cellar. Another learned that his street in Bremen no longer existed. Another got nothing at all and stared at the mail list each week with a face that gradually emptied of expectation. Through it, all the Americans distributed the letters without comment. Once, when a prisoner opened a card and lost control so quickly he had to sit in the dirt beside the parade ground, one of the guards nearest him started forward, then stopped, looked away, and simply told the men around the prisoner to give him space. That restraint hit Karl harder than sympathy might have. A man who gives a stranger room to grieve has recognized something human in him. The weather cooled. Dust gave way at times to mud. Texas in winter was not the brutal white freeze some had known in Russia or the Ardennes, but cold moved strangely across the open land and drove through loose timber in long gray winds. The camp answered with more repairs. Gaps in barracks walls were patched. Extra blankets appeared where older ones had worn thin. The infirmary stocked up on cough syrup, aspirin, and disinfectant. The prisoners saw these things, and still many could not quite admit what they added up to. "They are protecting their labor pool," Bremer said. Nothing more. But even he no longer sounded triumphant. Around Christmas, a chaplain came through the camp, offering services separately to Catholics and Protestants. Permission was given for a modest observance inside the mess hall under supervision. No candles were allowed beyond safe lantern light, but someone found evergreen branches from somewhere beyond the fences and wired them into a crude decoration above the front table. That night, as cold pressed against the walls and men sat shoulder to shoulder on benches, they heard the familiar words of old hymns rise in a place none of them had expected to survive long enough to hear them again. Otto sang badly and too loudly on purpose because homesickness had made him reckless. Karl sang softly. Even Bremer, after a long stiff silence, joined on the second verse of Still Nacht. When the service ended and the men filed back toward the barracks, they saw on the far side of the wire one American guard standing under a lamp, hands in his jacket pockets, listening. He did not understand the German words, but when the melody repeated as a few prisoners kept humming, he joined in under his breath in English. Silent night. The same tune, another language, same cold air between them. No one remarked on it afterward, and yet none of those who heard it forgot. January brought harder winds and a steadier fatigue. News from Europe came in fragments through newspapers glimpsed in guard shacks, radio murmurs overheard during work details, and the changing faces of the Americans themselves. There were references to the Ardennes, to a German offensive that had flared and burned, to casualties, to bitter fighting in snow and forest. The guards were not robots. Some had brothers or sons or nephews in the fighting. The prisoners knew this not because it was announced, but because names surfaced in half-heard conversations, because telegrams sometimes arrived at the administrative building, because 1 or 2 guards showed up on shift with the expression of men holding themselves together by command alone. Walker, the tall sergeant, received such news near the end of January. Karl happened to see it from the yard while waiting in account formation. An orderly crossed from the office, handed over a telegram envelope, and left. Walker read it once, folded it, read it again, and stood very still. Nothing about him moved except his jaw. He finished the shift. He shouted when needed, counted men, checked gates, signed a work detail roster, and did every part of his duty exactly as before. Only later did one of the prisoners who cleaned near the kitchen hear from an American corporal that Walker's younger brother had been killed in Belgium. The information spread quietly through barracks too like contraband that no one wanted to hold for too long. If the Germans had still needed proof that American restraint was not based on ignorance of loss, this was it. Walker now had a dead brother in Europe because the war still continued, because Germany still fought, because men like those behind the wire had worn the same eagle and field gray. Yet nothing in his behavior changed. He did not withhold food. He did not grow careless with punishments. He did not pick out Germans at random to humiliate. He remained hard, exact, and unbending in matters of order, but he did not become cruel. That disturbed Bremer more than any sermon could have. "He is waiting," Bremer said one evening, but nobody asked for what. Even he no longer seemed to believe his own explanations all the way through. The first real internal break inside the prisoner community came over Otto Weiss. The Bavarian boy had a way of speaking before fear could stop him. He was not political, not brave in any dramatic sense, only young enough that the truth sometimes reached his mouth before caution did. One afternoon, after returning from a work detail where Parker's widow had set out a bucket of boiled potatoes for the labor crew because the day had run long, Otto made the mistake of saying, within Bremer's hearing, "This is more food than my mother has had in months." The barracks went still. It was not only the content of the remark, but the tone, astonishment tinged with gratitude, that made it dangerous. Bremer crossed the aisle in 3 strides. "You thank them now?" he asked. Otto flushed. "I said nothing about thanking." "You compare your mother's suffering to what the enemy gives you and think that absolves them?" Otto looked toward Karl, then away. "I only said what is true." Bremer slapped him hard enough to knock him back against the bunk frame. Men rose. Someone swore. Another said, "Enough," too late. Bremer seized Otto's collar for a second blow, but before it landed a guard appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. It was Walker. He took in the scene with one glance, Bremer's fist, Otto's split lip, the circle of prisoners holding breath. "Break it," Walker said. Bremer ignored him, perhaps from fury, perhaps from habit. Walker crossed the distance, pulled Otto free with one hand, and shoved Bremer back with the other so sharply that the older German hit the bunk post and stumbled. The whole barracks seemed to stop existing for a second. Here was the enemy interfering in German matters. Here was a guard laying hands on a former Feldwebel. But what followed destroyed the old interpretation. Walker did not beat Bremer. He did not make a spectacle of Otto either. He called for another guard, removed both men separately, took statements through the interpreter, and by evening Bremer had been reassigned to another barracks with 2 of his most loyal followers. The official reason was discipline. The unofficial effect was greater. For the first time, weaker prisoners in barracks too slept without listening for ideological lectures in the dark. Otto, lip-stitched by the medic, lay awake that night not from fear but from confusion. "He protected me," he said into the darkness. Karl, from the bunk below, answered after a long pause. "Yes." "From a German?" "Yes." The boy turned that over like a foreign coin. "Then what exactly are we supposed to believe now?" Karl stared at the ceiling planks. The answer came from somewhere deeper than comfort. Whatever remains after the lies stop working. February moved over the camp with a deceptive dullness, the kind that precedes disaster not because disaster announces itself, but because routine teaches men to trust the repetition of ordinary days. Windy mornings. Work details. Soup. Mud. Letters. Inspections. Repairs. Coughs. A few men from the infirmary. A few new arrivals. 1 or 2 transfers out. The Americans checked fire buckets, lantern oil, stove vents, and roof fastenings because that was what regulations required, and because the camp had already become for them what it had slowly become for the prisoners too, a place whose safety was made out of many small precautions. But war leaves little room for perfect control, and wood, wind, stored straw, and lightning can combine faster than human plans. It began after dark in the first week of March, though later no two accounts would agree on the exact minute. Rain had started as a hard tapping against the barracks roofs and turned within half an hour into a full storm driving sideways across the camp. Wind shoved at walls. Door hinges groaned. Somewhere loose metal banged in frantic rhythm. Most of the prisoners in Barracks 3 had already settled into the uneasy half-sleep common to men in confinement when lightning struck close enough to fill the interior with white light for an instant, so complete it seemed the whole world had been turned inside out. A second later came the crack, not rolling thunder but a violent splitting report from somewhere behind the service sheds. Several men sat upright. Somebody cursed. Someone else said, "Transformer," though none of them knew the camp wiring well enough to say. Then came the smell. At first it was only a threat of it, burned pitch, hot resin, something wrong inside wet wood. Then came shouting outside, feet pounding through mud, and a voice in English that had no trace of routine in it now. Fire. The word moved through the barracks in both languages at once. Men lurched from bunks. One of the side walls glowed suddenly orange through cracks in the planks. The storm-fed wind drove sparks under the eaves, and whatever had caught outside, straw, storage timber, roofing tar, passed the danger to the building with terrifying speed. Panic inside crowded sleeping quarters has its own physics. Men do not think in lines. They think in openings. They grabbed boots, blankets, canteens, letters, anything closest to hand. Some rushed the main door and jammed it from within before it could open fully. Others climbed from upper bunks into bodies below. Smoke thickened fast at one end of the room where flame had climbed the wall and begun to run along the rafters. Otto, sleeping near the middle aisle, hit the floor wrong and twisted his ankle. Karl dragged him up. Somewhere to the left a man screamed that Franz Meissner was still on the top bunk and couldn't get down. The lamps had gone out. The room flashed between darkness and firelight. For one horrible slice of time, many of the prisoners believed exactly the same thing, that this was how all the warnings finally became true. Not by deliberate execution, not by a squad against the wire, but by being locked inside a wooden prison while the enemy preserved itself outside. It would have been easy, in practical terms, for the Americans to choose caution first. The storm was violent. The barracks were full of enemy prisoners. The roof could collapse. The fire might spread to other structures. No tribunal in wartime would have called it murder if guards had focused only on containing the blaze from outside. But that is not what happened. The main door burst inward under blows from outside, and a sheet of rain knifed through the opening. In it stood two Americans with wet blankets over their shoulders and axes in hand, followed by Walker, shouting through smoke. "Move. Oh. Move now." He and the others drove themselves into the crush, not away from it. One axe went to the jammed side panel where frightened bodies had trapped each other. Another guard smashed the nearest window and kicked out the remaining shards. Somewhere outside more voices yelled for crowbars, stretchers, water buckets. Smoke layered down from the ceiling. Karl felt Otto's hand wrenching at his sleeve and shoved the boy toward the door only to hear Franz again, still above, coughing, tangled in blanket and panic. Karl started toward the sound. Breathing burned. Then, before he reached the bunk row, Walker was there first, climbing half onto the frame as if the smoke belonged to someone else. He hauled Franz down by the shoulders, nearly dropped him, shoved him toward Karl, then turned back because another voice had cried out from the far end. Through the window-opening men were being dragged into rain and mud by guards, who vanished in and out of the smoke like figures cut from shadow. Outside, someone had already slashed a section of inner wire to clear a better evacuation path away from the burning wall. The cut itself, simple and practical, carried more trust than many prisoners believed possible. A way lay open. Dark land beyond. Storm-masking sound. In another story some might have run. Yet almost none did. There was nowhere to go in rural Texas in the middle of a night storm, half-dressed, half-blind, and more than that, there were still men inside. Otto limped into the mud, turned, and stared back at the fire with the face of someone watching the end of the world hesitate. The rain hissed on the outer wall, but could not keep pace with wind-fed flames along the roofline. The camp had become movement, command, and light. Lanterns swung. Buckets passed hand to hand. The medic, Haskins, knelt in mud beside coughing prisoners and checked airways, burns, shock. "Blankets here," he shouted. "Keep them sitting up. Not flat. You, help me hold his head." The "you" was to a German prisoner with singed hair and no coat. There was no time left for categories. The man obeyed at once. Nearby 2 guards and a prisoner together heaved a water drum onto its side to refill pails faster. Another guard tore his own field jacket off and threw it over a shivering half-dressed German who had lost everything but his trousers and boots. Men who had imagined themselves despised now found themselves wrapped, dragged, ordered, and kept alive by hands they had been trained to call inhuman. Carl had just pushed Franz toward Haskins when he saw Walker vanish back into the smoke again, this time deeper than before. "No!" someone shouted in English from outside. "Roof's going." Walker ignored it. Carl did not think. Perhaps later he would tell himself he chose. In truth, his body moved before argument could form. He pulled the wet blanket from his own shoulders and ran after the sergeant into the barracks. Inside, the world had narrowed to sparks, choking heat, and the cracking groan of timber surrendering above. The aisle was a red tunnel. On the far side, near the rear bunks, a shape struggled on the floor beneath a fallen crossbeam. Walker was already there, crouched low, lifting one end while coughing violently. It was not a prisoner trapped beneath the beam, but Private Jesse Cole, the youngest of the guards on the shift, who had gone in through the back panel after hearing a cry and had been knocked down when part of the ceiling gave way. For an instant all 3 men looked at one another through smoke so thick it erased everything else. Enemy, guard, prisoner. Then the beam slipped. Carl dropped beside Walker and heaved. Between them they raised enough weight for Cole to crawl free on hands and knees. The roof snapped above like rifle fire. "Move!" Walker roared, and this time all 3 did. Later no one would remember exactly how they emerged, only that one moment they were in choking orange darkness, and the next they were stumbling through the broken side wall into rain so cold it felt like resurrection. Cole collapsed first. Walker fell to one knee beside him. Carl, unable to stop coughing, tried to stand and failed. Hands reached for all 3 at once. No one stopped to sort whose uniform mattered most. The remainder of the night passed in pieces stamped too deeply into memory ever to blur. The half-ruined barracks steaming in stormlight, black rafters glowing and then caving inward, prisoners wrapped in blankets on the floor of the mess hall, on stretchers in the infirmary, on spare cots taken from storage, Haskins moving from man to man with soot across his face and his sleeves burned through at the cuffs. Guards carrying kettles of heated broth after midnight because men in shock needed warmth more than speeches. A section of the camp administrative building cleared so the displaced prisoners could be brought inside out of the wind. One American corporal giving up his own bunk without announcement and sleeping upright on a chair near the office stove. Walker with blistered hands refusing treatment until the last count of missing men came back complete. No one had died. That fact alone seemed impossible by dawn. Several men had burns, smoke damage, broken fingers, bruised ribs, and one badly twisted ankle besides Otto's, but no one had been left in the fire. When the storm passed near morning and the first gray light spread over the camp, the burned barracks stood half open to the sky, blackened timbers leaning inward over a floor of sodden ash. Mud around it was scored by boot prints, drag marks, dropped buckets, and the deep tracks of men who had run toward danger in the dark instead of away from it. The smell of wet charcoal hung over everything. Prisoners moved through breakfast in silence. Tin cups touched tables. Bread was handed along. No accusations rose. No mutter about American tricks sounded convincing now, Not after men had watched guards slash wire open for evacuation. Not after seeing them dive through smoke for enemy prisoners. Not after feeling their own frozen shoulders covered with American blankets. Bremer, who had been housed in another barracks by then, but had joined the displaced in the mess hall, said almost nothing. His right eyebrow was singed away, and one side of his face had a narrow burn along the cheek. He had been among the last out, dragged half-conscious by 2 guards through a side opening. Karl knew because he had seen it. The Feldwebel stared at his bread for a long time before lifting it. By afternoon work crews, mixed groups of Americans and prisoners under supervision were already clearing debris from the site because camps do not stop becoming dangerous just because danger has already struck. The Germans noticed another thing then. The Americans did not rebuild first for themselves. Priority went to housing the displaced prisoners safely before the next cold night. Lumber that might have gone to staff repairs went instead to barracks partitions and temporary bunks. The mess hall remained crowded for days because no one wanted the men from Barracks 3 sleeping in compromised structures. Again, there was no speech attached to this choice. That made it heavier. A morality quietly practiced is often harder to dismiss than a morality loudly proclaimed. The psychological change inside the camp did not happen all at once after the fire, but its direction could no longer be mistaken. Men who had once looked toward the guard line only with hatred or calculation now sometimes looked there with something more complicated and, to many, more painful. Gratitude toward an enemy can feel like treason when one has been educated to think in absolutes. But facts exert pressure. Otto found himself watching Walker's bandaged hands during counts and feeling a shame so new he could not yet name it. Karl avoided the ruined barracks area for a week because every time he smelled the wet char in the air, he saw again the moment inside the smoke when Walker had been lifting the beam off coal and still would not leave a trapped man. Franz Meissner, whose bunk had nearly become his coffin, began volunteering for extra cleanup details without complaint, as if work itself had become a way to answer the debt of breath. And among the Americans, something shifted too, though more subtly. They had seen prisoners return into danger rather than run for open dark. They had seen Karl help drag Cole out. They had seen Germans hand buckets, hold bandages, support stretchers, and remain in place even when wire had been cut. Mutual recognition did not erase hierarchy. The camp remained a camp. Orders were orders. Rifles remained loaded. Punishments still existed for violations. But the emotional geometry changed. During the rebuilding phase, a guard handed Otto a hammer with the casual expectation that he would use it and hand it back. Such trust, even temporary and supervised, would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. Otto took the tool carefully, as though one wrong movement might break more than wood. On the second evening after the fire, while the wind had gone quiet and men in temporary quarters tried to settle among unfamiliar coughs and shifting bodies, Karl found Walker outside the infirmary smoking one-handed because the bandages on his palms made the task clumsy. The sergeant looked up when footsteps approached but did not stiffen. Karl halted 2 paces away, unsure what language gratitude properly belonged to. His English was poor. Walker's German existed only as commands and camp vocabulary. In the end, Karl touched his own chest, then made a small, awkward motion toward the burned barracks and said, "For there." Walker looked at him for a second. "For getting Cole out?" he asked. Karl understood only the name and the tone. He nodded. Walker drew once on the cigarette, winced at the pull against his bandaged fingers, and exhaled into the cold air. "Guess we're square," he said. Karl did not know the phrase then, but he remembered the sound of it for years. Spring approached. Mud softened. The horizon took on a wider blue. Work details resumed in fuller rhythm once emergency repairs were complete. Yet the men leaving the gates each morning were not the same men who had arrived under rumor and suspicion the previous autumn. They still carried grief, still longed for home, still wore the knowledge of defeat in their shoulders. But something had been cut through. The lie had failed. Not completely, because human beings cling to self-protective narratives with astonishing endurance, but enough that it could no longer command the whole inner life of the camp. In the fields and depots, conversations changed. The Germans noticed American speech about families more than before. They heard names of towns in Iowa, Georgia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. They heard a guard complain about the price of machine parts back home. They heard Parker, the widower farmer, say once while counting tools, "If my boy comes back, I'll never let him see another field if I can help it." He was not talking to the prisoners, yet they heard him. On another day, Parker's daughter-in-law brought a pail of buttermilk out to the edge of the field for the labor crew and left it with the guards without looking directly at the Germans. Her face was set hard, the face of someone determined not to give more than duty required, but the buttermilk remained. Men drank from tin cups in silence. Civilians, they slowly realized, were not a single thing any more than prisoners were. Some glared with open hatred. Some would never forgive. Some wanted the Germans nowhere near their roads or their children. Yet even among the bitter there were lines. There were people who had buried sons and still did not choose sadism when wounded enemies were placed before them. The prisoners had not been taught to expect that. At the end of April, news from Europe accelerated. Italy's collapse, Mussolini's death, cities taken, lines shattered, Soviet advances, American and British breakthroughs. The Reich was no longer a future to be defended, but a shell caving in from every side. Inside the camp, the reaction to such news divided men in private ways. Some met it with relief so profound it seemed almost like physical weakness. Better ended than prolonged. Better lost than endlessly fed with more boys. Others went rigid and silent as though defeat had reached them only then. Bremer moved through these days like a man whose internal scaffolding had given way one beam at a time and left only posture standing. The final blow came not from battlefield reports but from images. American authorities began making sure German prisoners were exposed, however unevenly, to documented accounts of what had been found in liberated camps in Europe, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, places that until then had been rumor, denial, or distant shadow even to many who wore the same nation's uniform. Newspapers were circulated more openly under supervision. Explanatory talks were given. At one point a group of prisoners was shown photographic evidence in a camp assembly room. The effect was unlike anything the guards' discipline or the fire had achieved, because now the moral mirror turned. Carl stood in that room with other prisoners and looked at the images of stacked bodies, starved faces, pits, striped uniforms on living skeletons, and could not make his mind hold them at the same scale as the ordinary sentences of camp life in Texas. Not because the evidence seemed false, but because truth had become too large. He thought of Walker's burned hands. He thought of Haskins kneeling in mud to save enemy lungs. He thought of the Christmas hymn Under the Lamp. And then he thought of what had been done in Germany's name, with German systems, German transport, German orders, German paperwork. The contrast was so violent that it altered him more deeply than defeat had. Bremer muttered afterward that enemy propaganda had always used photographs, but even he could not keep his voice from fraying. Otto did not speak for hours. That night he asked Carl, "Do you think they know? The Americans, I mean what we knew, what we did not know." Carl sat on his bunk with the newspaper still folded beside him. "I think," he said slowly, "they know we wore the uniform. For some of them, that is enough. For others, maybe not. But they have not treated us as if the worst is the only thing a man can be." Otto swallowed. "Why?" Carl looked toward the window, where evening light had caught the wire in a dull silver line. "Because perhaps they want to remain different from what they are fighting." The war in Europe ended in May. The camp learned before dawn from a burst of activity around the administrative buildings, from trucks arriving, from radios turned up, from the unmistakable release in American posture that no discipline could fully conceal. By mid-morning it was official. Germany had surrendered. The Reich for which so many had marched, obeyed, feared, lied, fought, and bled was done. For a while, the camp became a theater of restrained contradiction. Beyond the wire, some Americans laughed, embraced, or stood stunned with hands on hips as if they had been holding their breath for years. One guard sat on an overturned crate and cried without shame. Another lit a cigar with trembling fingers and handed one to Parker when the farmer came by with a delivery. In the prisoner compounds there was no single response. Some men sat down where they were and stared at the ground. Some crossed themselves. Some cursed. Some were relieved enough to seem ashamed of the relief. A few, among the hardest believers, went pale with an anger that had nowhere left to march. Otto whispered, "It's over," as if afraid the sentence would be withdrawn. Karl believed him and did not. War had a way of lingering after declarations. And indeed, captivity did not end with surrender. That perhaps was the next great lesson in Texas. History's loud endings are followed by long administrative middles. The camp kept running. Men were still counted, fed, inspected, and assigned labor. America still needed workers. Germany, shattered and occupied, could not receive everyone back at once. Repatriation would take months, in some cases longer. At first some prisoners took this as betrayal. Had not peace arrived? Why were they still behind wire? But here again procedure, maddening and unromantic, governed reality. Medical exams had to be completed. Transfer rosters built. Ships allocated. Records matched to names. Quarantine concerns addressed. Labor needs negotiated. There was no dramatic cruelty waiting after surrender, only time and paperwork. In that anticlimax, something almost as important as the fire took shape. The Americans did not change their behavior now that Germany was beaten. They did not suddenly become careless because the enemy had no state left to answer to. If anything, the camp became more settled. Men received more mail. Educational materials appeared in limited form. Some prisoners were allowed more organized recreation in fenced yards. Work details continued under guard, but with less brittle tension. On Sundays, the compound sometimes held soccer matches using a patched ball and improvised goal markers, and more than once guards watched from outside the wire with expressions close to amusement. Not warmth exactly, but not contempt either. Summer came hard and bright to Texas. The plains shimmered. Cicadas screamed in the heat. Work details moved earlier to avoid the worst of midday where possible. The Germans grew leaner, stronger, and more browned by the sun than when they had arrived. Their boots were repaired. Their uniforms no longer carried the smell of Europe but of dust, soap, and work. Karl found himself thinking less often of capture and more often of return, though return had become a strange word. What was he returning to? Cologne had been bombed. His sister's latest letter was only a scrap routed through Red Cross channels, saying she was alive, their mother dead from pneumonia in January, the apartment gone, the cathedral still standing though all around it lay ruin. Otto's village still existed, but his father was missing on the Eastern Front and no one expected a miracle. Even Bremer, whose certainty once filled rooms, received word that his wife and daughters had fled west ahead of the Soviets and might now be anywhere. Loss equalized what ideology had once sorted. One afternoon in late summer, while repairing a fence line on Parker's property, Karl cut his palm deep on twisted wire. The blood came fast. He wrapped it badly with his sleeve, more annoyed than alarmed, but Parker saw and said, "Hold up." The old widower called the guard, and within minutes Haskins, still with a faint scar at his neck from the fire night, had the wound cleaned and closed. Parker stood by with a face like carved wood. When Haskins had finished, the farmer said to Karl, not looking directly at him, "You can't grip pliers with a hand like that." It was almost the first full sentence Parker had ever spoken to a prisoner. Karl, uncertain whether English courtesy applied between former enemies, answered in clumsy pieces. "Thank you. I work one hand." Parker snorted, half irritation, half disbelief. You'll work no hand till tomorrow. I'm short on labor, not brains." Then he walked away. Later, while the truck was being loaded for return to camp, Parker came back with a paper sack and left it on the tailgate beside the water barrel. Inside were peaches, bruised but sweet, too ripe to keep. No explanation accompanied them. The guards distributed the fruit without ceremony. The prisoners ate in silence, juice and disbelief on their fingers. It was not absolution. It was not friendship. It was something perhaps more difficult. A civilian whose son was still missing in Europe, choosing not to punish the men placed in front of him for crimes committed by history at scale. In the autumn of 1945, the first larger repatriation lists began to matter in a way rumor never had. Names were posted. Medical checks intensified. Men were transferred to larger holding installations or ports according to shipping schedules. Each list sent a tremor through the barracks. Relief for one man meant uncertainty for another. Goodbyes were awkward because captivity had made intimacy both necessary and embarrassing. Otto's name appeared before Karl's. The Bavarian boy carried his news around all day with a face that could not decide between joy and guilt. "I didn't ask for this first," he told Karl that evening. "I know," Karl said. "Your face says so." Otto laughed weakly. "What if home is worse than here?" It was the kind of question only a prisoner could ask without irony. Karl looked around the barracks, at the patched walls, the bunks, the footlockers, the place that had once seemed the end of dignity and had instead become the stage on which dignity was tested. "Then it is still home," he said. Otto left 3 days later with a blanket roll, a small packet of letters, repaired boots, and an ankle that still stiffened in bad weather from the fire night. Before boarding the transport truck, he did something none of them had expected from the boy, who once trembled at the sound of English orders. He stopped in front of Walker, who was supervising the departure roster, straightened as much as a prisoner with a blanket roll could, and extended his hand. The yard went quiet in the small way yards do when something unusual but not forbidden occurs. Walker looked at the offered hand, then at Otto. For a second his face remained unreadable. Then he shifted the clipboard under one arm and took the hand once, firmly. "Safe trip," he said. Otto nodded, unable to find English words equal to what had happened in Texas and not trusting his German with it either. Then he climbed aboard and was gone in dust. Karl's own departure did not come until spring of 1946. By then the camp had thinned. New war elsewhere, new priorities, and the slow unwinding of victory had altered the American mood. The guards were tired in a different way now. Men spoke of discharge, home, marriages delayed, businesses to reopen, farms to reclaim. Haskins was leaving the service in May. Walker, rumor said, would stay on a little longer because he did not yet know what to do with civilian life after losing his brother. Karl spent his final weeks in Texas half inside memory already. He worked, he counted, he ate. He wrote one more letter to his sister promising he was coming back, and he walked once past the site where Barracks 3 had stood. A replacement structure occupied nearby ground now, practical and unremarkable. Only someone who had been there in the storm would have known exactly where the worst of the flames had been. The day before his transfer out, Karl asked through the interpreter whether he might return a borrowed item from the infirmary directly. It was merely a pencil stub and a small English phrase sheet Haskins had once let him keep while drafting addresses. Permission was granted. Haskins accepted the items with a grin that made him look younger than war had any right to allow. "Keep the phrase sheet," he said. "You'll need English on the docks." Karl tried to refuse. Haskins pushed it back. "Take it. That's an order." It was the first time the word order had sounded almost kind. Later, near the gate, Karl found Walker overseeing a tool inventory. The sergeant's hands had healed badly, shiny along the palms where the burns had been deepest. Karl looked at them, then at the gate, then back. "Texas," he said, because it was the biggest word he could manage for all of it. Walker waited. Carl searched for the rest. Not what we were told. Walker's face did not soften, but something in it eased. He slid the last tool onto the rack, marked the sheet, and answered after a moment. A lot of things weren't. It was not forgiveness. It was not comradeship. It was a truth large enough for both of them to stand inside briefly without lying. The next morning Carl left the camp on a truck with 27 others, rattling past the wire, the towers, the barracks, the water tank, the sheds, the same road by which he had first arrived afraid and prepared for degradation. He carried little: a blanket roll, a tin cup, letters, the phrase sheet, a scar on his forearm from the night of the fire, and a knowledge that no authority in Germany had ever intended him to possess. America had not been paradise. He had been a prisoner. He had been counted, fenced, guarded, searched, and ordered. But captivity there had not matched the shape of hatred he had been promised. Instead it had been strict, imperfect, exhausting, and, at decisive moments, fair. He had seen Americans punish theft, break up fights, enforce work, deny escape, and maintain order with absolute seriousness. He had also seen them protect the weak, treat the sick, refuse mob anger, share warmth in a storm, and run into a burning building for enemy soldiers who could offer them nothing but smoke and wait. When the ship eventually carried him back across the Atlantic, Germany rose to meet him not as the nation he had left, but as a continent of rubble, queues, black markets, broken stations, women hauling coal, children learning silence, and men returning from fronts and prisons to streets that no longer remembered their footsteps. In Cologne he found his sister thinner, older, alive. He found the apartment gone. He found familiar roads interrupted by mountains of brick and windows looking onto absence. He found neighbors who wanted stories of America that confirmed the bitterness still needed to survive defeat. Some expected tales of humiliation. Others demanded proof that German soldiers had suffered nobly under enemy cruelty. Carl disappointed them. At first he did so cautiously, because post-war Germany was full of people who preferred myths to moral inventory. But with time his telling grew simpler and firmer. He spoke of heat and dust and wire. He spoke of measured rations and long workdays. He spoke of guards who were not sentimental. Then he spoke of the fire. He spoke of Americans cutting open a path to safety, of medics in mud, of soup heated through the night, of burned hands, of a young guard trapped beneath a beam, of a sergeant who had lost his brother in Belgium and still did not choose revenge, of a widower farmer whose son never came home and who still left peaches on a truck for German prisoners. He spoke of the shame of discovering that the enemy had behaved with more decency toward him in defeat than the state he had served had shown to countless innocents under its power. That was the hardest part for listeners to bear, and therefore the most necessary. Years later, when people asked him what he remembered most clearly of the war, they expected artillery, retreat, capture, ocean crossing, surrender. He remembered those things. But when he answered honestly, it was often Texas that rose first: the dry immensity of the sky, the smell of rain on dust, the shock of hearing Christmas hymns under barbed wire, the sight of American boots running toward flames while prisoners stumbled the other way, the realization that power and cruelty were not the same thing unless men chose to make them the same. He would say that the camp taught him two truths at once, and that they could not be separated. The first was that captivity strips away illusions quickly when survival is at stake. The second was that some illusions die only when confronted by undeniable conduct. Propaganda had survived the train, the fences, the towers, the searches, the counted meals, the work details, even the hatred in civilian eyes. It did not survive the night the enemy risked everything to keep him alive. In the louder history of the war, such moments take up almost no room. Maps do not mark them. Parades do not celebrate them. They are too small for monuments and too complicated for slogans. But they endure where it matters, in the memory of those who learned, too late and at terrible cost, that a nation is revealed not only by how it fights, but by how it behaves when victory gives it the power to do as it pleases. In rural Texas, far from the ruined cities of Europe and the speeches of men who had promised certainty, a group of German prisoners discovered that the most unsettling thing about the Americans was not their strength, not their wealth, not their reach across an ocean, but their refusal, at the decisive hour, to become the monsters they had been described as. And for those who had arrived convinced that humiliation and slow destruction waited behind American wire, that refusal changed the moral shape of the war forever.